The best gift would be if you just died. Those were the words my daughter said to me during my 72nd birthday dinner, with a smile on her face and a glass of champagne in her hand. Everyone at the table froze. My son-in-law stared down at his plate. My granddaughter looked like she had stopped breathing. And me? I simply smiled and took a sip of water. What none of them knew was that before the week was over, I would make one phone call that would change all of their lives. My name is Margaret Foster. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and until recently, I believed my daughter Rachel loved me. Maybe not in the warm, affectionate way she did when she was little, but in the practical way grown children are supposed to love their aging parents. At least that's what I kept telling myself. That evening was supposed to be a celebration. I had reserved a private dining room at a beautiful steakhouse overlooking the river. The room glowed with soft golden lights reflected off the water outside. The staff had decorated the table with fresh flowers, and a 3-layer birthday cake sat near the window waiting to be served. I paid for everything just as I always did. Rachel arrived 20 minutes late. She swept into the room carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car. Behind her came her husband Jason and their daughter Emily. Rachel kissed my cheek quickly before sitting down and immediately checking her phone. "Traffic was awful," she said without looking at me. "You know how it is." I smiled and nodded. Over the years I had learned not to expect too much. Dinner moved along with polite conversation. Rachel talked about a business venture she and Jason were planning. Jason discussed rising property values. Emily spoke about college applications. Nobody asked me much of anything. Nobody asked how I had been sleeping. Nobody asked whether I still missed my husband after 3 years. Nobody asked about the garden I spent all spring planting. I listened. I smiled. I paid the bill. When dessert arrived, the server lit the candles on my cake. Everyone sang. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel happy. Maybe family gatherings were awkward these days, but at least we were together. Then Rachel stood up and lifted her glass. "I want to make a toast," she announced. I remember feeling touched. I thought maybe she was finally going to say something kind. Maybe she would tell a funny childhood story. Maybe she would thank me for always being there. Instead, she laughed softly and said, "Honestly, Mom, the best gift would be if you just died and stopped making everything so complicated." The words landed with a strange calmness. It was like hearing a window break in another room. For a second, nobody moved. The silence felt heavy enough to touch. Rachel chuckled nervously as if it were some harmless joke. Jason gave an uncomfortable smile. Emily's face turned pale. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. Not as the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. Not as the teenager whose college tuition I worked overtime to afford. Not as the young mother I had helped through countless emergencies. I saw her exactly as she was in that moment. A woman who no longer viewed me as family, only as an obstacle. I smiled, picked up my fork, and took another bite of cake. "Well," I said quietly, "that's certainly an unusual birthday wish." The conversation stumbled forward after that, but something inside me had shifted. A door had quietly closed. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone in my kitchen staring at the leftover cake. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about all the years I had spent helping Rachel. The tuition checks. The mortgage assistance. The monthly transfers. The investments. The emergency loans that somehow were never repaid. Then I walked into my study, opened a locked drawer and removed a folder. Inside were documents that Rachel knew nothing about. Documents connected to every dollar she believed would always be there. I sat down at my desk and looked at the clock. It was 11:47 p.m. Then I reached for my phone and called my attorney. I did not sleep much after that phone call. The house felt unusually quiet, even by widow standards. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window above the sink. The backyard was dark except for the small solar lights lining the garden path. Harold and I had installed those lights together nearly 10 years ago. He always said a home should feel welcoming, even when nobody was expected to visit. Back then, people visited. Rachel used to stop by every Sunday afternoon. She would bring coffee and tell me about her week. At least that is how I remembered it. As I stood there in the darkness, I realized those visits had gradually changed over the years. First came the requests for help with tuition payments. Then the down payment assistance when she and Jason bought their first house. Then emergency repairs. Then business investments. Then monthly support that was supposed to be temporary. Temporary stretched into months. Months stretched into years. Somewhere along the way, our conversations stopped being conversations. They became transactions. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30 and followed my usual routine. I made coffee. I watered the plants on the sun porch. I fed the neighborhood cat that occasionally visited my yard. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. At 9 o'clock, my attorney, Daniel Mercer, returned my call. Daniel had handled my estate planning for more than a decade. He had known Harold. He had attended his funeral. More importantly, he understood that I was not someone who made emotional decisions lightly. "You sound serious," he said after greeting me. "I am serious," I replied. There was a brief silence on the line. "Then come in this afternoon." After hanging up, I opened the folder from my desk again. Most people would have been surprised by what it contained. Rachel certainly would have been. There were records of educational accounts, investment contributions, business funding agreements, property assistance documents. Over the years, I had quietly provided financial support totaling more money than I cared to calculate. Not because anyone forced me, because I believed family helped family. Looking at those papers now felt different. For the first time, I was not reviewing them as a mother. I was reviewing them as a person who had spent years ignoring uncomfortable truths. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said. Her voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. "Good afternoon. Just wanted to check in. Did you get home okay last night?" I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, but because it arrived nearly 14 hours too late. "I got home fine." "Good." I was worried. The lie sat between us like an extra person on the call. Rachel had not been worried. If she had been worried, she would have called before noon. She would have called before going to sleep. She would have called when she realized what she had said. Instead, she moved quickly to another subject. "Jason and I wanted to talk to you about something later this week." Of course they did. "What is it?" "Nothing major. Just a business opportunity." I looked down at the folder resting on my kitchen table. A business opportunity. Those words had become expensive over the years. "We can discuss it another time," I said calmly. "I have appointments this week." She sounded disappointed, but only briefly. Then she said goodbye and ended the call. I sat there for a long moment after the screen went dark. For the first time, I noticed something important. Rachel had called because she needed something. Not because of what happened at my birthday dinner. Not because she regretted her words. Not because she cared how I felt. The realization hurt. But it also brought clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to learn, could be far more valuable than comfort. That afternoon, I drove across town to Daniel Mercer's office. The building sat on a quiet corner near the courthouse, the same place where Harold and I had signed our estate documents years ago. Walking through those familiar glass doors felt strangely different now. For decades, I had entered that office thinking about protecting my family. This time I was thinking about protecting myself. Daniel greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a conference room overlooking the city. He studied my face for a moment before speaking. "You look like someone who has finally made up her mind." I sat down slowly and placed the folder on the table. "I think I have." For the next hour, we reviewed document after document. Educational funds, investment accounts, trust arrangements, records of financial assistance. Numbers filled the pages. Some were larger than I remembered. Others surprised even me. Daniel adjusted his glasses and looked across the table. "Margaret, do you realize how much support you have provided over the years?" I stared at the papers. I never kept score. Perhaps that was the problem. His words lingered in the room long after he said them. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about Rachel as a little girl. I remembered school concerts where she searched the audience until she spotted me. I remembered soccer games on Saturday mornings and science projects spread across the kitchen table. Back then, she used to thank me for everything. Somewhere between childhood and middle age, Gratitude had quietly disappeared. By the time I reached my driveway, my phone was ringing again. Rachel. I answered. Mom, I forgot to mention something earlier, she said. Jason and I are meeting with some investors next month. We are really excited about this opportunity. I listened quietly. That sounds important. It is. Actually, we were hoping you might want to be involved. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern. Not an apology. Not even curiosity about how I was feeling. An opportunity. Another one. What exactly does involved mean? I asked. Nothing complicated. We can go over details at dinner this weekend. I could hear enthusiasm in her voice now. The kind that only appeared when money entered the conversation. I will think about it, I replied. Her excitement faded slightly. Rachel was not accustomed to uncertainty from me. For years, my answers had been predictable. If she needed help, I helped. If she needed money, I found a way. If she needed support, I provided it. The pattern had become so normal that none of us questioned it anymore. After ending the call, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the back patio. The autumn air carried a slight chill. Leaves drifted across the yard in slow circles. I watched them for a long time. Later that evening, my granddaughter Emily called. Unlike Rachel, she rarely contacted me with an agenda. Hi, Grandma, she said. I just wanted to check on you. The simplicity of those words nearly broke my heart. That is kind of you, sweetheart. We talked for almost 30 minutes. College applications. Classes. Her part-time job at the bookstore. Ordinary things. Before hanging up, her voice became quieter. Grandma. Yes. I was really uncomfortable at your birthday dinner. I waited. You did not deserve that. I looked out at the darkening sky beyond my backyard fence. Thank you, Emily. I mean it. After the call ended, I sat there long after sunset. The porch light illuminated the empty chair across from me where Harold used to sit every evening. For the first time since my birthday, I felt something besides disappointment. I felt clarity. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. And clarity was beginning to reveal truths that I could no longer ignore. The following Saturday, I drove to Rachel and Jason's house for dinner. Their neighborhood was one of the newer developments on the north side of town, filled with large homes, freshly planted trees, and identical mailboxes lined up along perfectly maintained streets. I remembered helping them with the down payment nearly 12 years earlier. At the time, they had promised it was only a temporary loan. Temporary had become another word that lasted forever in our family. Rachel greeted me at the door with unusual enthusiasm. She hugged me quickly and ushered me inside. Jason was already setting dishes on the dining table. Everything felt carefully arranged, almost rehearsed. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. Soft music played through hidden speakers. On the surface, it looked like a warm family gathering. Beneath the surface, I could feel something else. During dinner, Rachel dominated the conversation. She spoke about market opportunities, growth projections, and expansion plans. Jason occasionally added details. Emily remained mostly quiet, pushing vegetables around her plate while listening. I noticed something I might have missed years ago. Neither Rachel nor Jason spoke about the business as if it were their dream. They spoke about it as if success had already been guaranteed. As if the money required to make it happen was already sitting safely in an account waiting for them. Eventually Rachel set down her fork and smiled. Mom, this is what I wanted to discuss. There it was. The real reason for the invitation. I nodded politely. I figured. Jason slid a presentation folder across the table. Charts. Numbers. Projections. The pages looked impressive. I spent several minutes reviewing them. Then I looked up. How much are you asking for? Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Jason. $250,000. She said the number casually, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. I folded my hands in my lap. That is a significant investment. Not really, Rachel replied with a small laugh. For you, I mean. The words settled heavily in the room. For you. Not for most people. Not for a retired widow. For you. It was remarkable how easily people spent money that did not belong to them. Years ago, that comment would have hurt my feelings. This time it revealed something far more valuable. It revealed assumptions. Rachel had stopped seeing financial support as generosity. She viewed it as an entitlement. As dinner continued, I asked questions. Serious questions. Revenue forecasts. Risk assessments. Operating expenses. Neither Rachel nor Jason seemed prepared for detailed scrutiny. Their confidence weakened slightly with each answer. They had expected approval, not evaluation. After dessert, Emily followed me outside while I waited for my car to warm up. The evening air was cool enough to require a light jacket. She stood quietly beside me for a moment before speaking. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." She looked down at the driveway. "I do not think they realize how much pressure they put on you." I studied her expression. There was concern there. Genuine concern. "What makes you say that?" Emily hesitated. "Because they talk about your help like it is guaranteed. Like it will always be there." The porch light cast soft shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. "And what do you think?" I asked gently. She looked directly at me. "I think people should appreciate what they are given." After she went back inside, I remained standing beside my car for several minutes. The contrast between mother and daughter could not have been clearer. One saw support as an obligation. The other saw it as a gift. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I realized something important. For years, I had been afraid that changing the arrangement would damage my relationship with Rachel. Now I was beginning to understand a much harder truth. There might not have been a real relationship left to damage. The week that followed felt unusually calm. Not because anything had improved, but because I had stopped fighting reality. Every morning I followed the same routine. Coffee at 6:30. A walk through the garden. A few chapters from whatever book sat on my nightstand. The difference was that I was finally paying attention. For years, I had been so focused on preserving family harmony that I ignored things that should have concerned me. Now I noticed everything. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel called with an update. Several documents were ready for review. Nothing had been changed yet, but options were being prepared. Trust structures, beneficiary designations, charitable allocations, practical matters, responsible matters. I thanked him and scheduled another meeting. After hanging up, I drove to the grocery store. It was one of those ordinary errands that used to feel invisible. As I pushed my cart through the produce section, I ran into an old friend named Carol. We had known each other for nearly 20 years. After exchanging greetings, she smiled and asked how Rachel was doing. The question triggered an unexpected memory. Years earlier, when Rachel was struggling after college, Carol had quietly helped her find a job through a business contact. Rachel never thanked her. At the time, I made excuses. She was busy. She was stressed. She forgot. Looking back, I realized how often I had translated poor behavior into understandable circumstances. Perhaps that had been my greatest mistake. Not the money. Not the assistance. The excuses. Later that evening, Emily called again. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." There was a brief pause. "Did my parents ask you for money at dinner?" I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Why would you ask that?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because they have been talking about it all week." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. What exactly have they been saying? Emily sounded uncomfortable. "Mostly that they are confident everything will work out. Mom keeps saying there is no reason to worry because you always come through." I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was again. Not gratitude. Not hope. Certainty. The certainty of people who viewed someone else's sacrifice as part of their financial plan. Emily lowered her voice. "Grandma, I do not think they mean to sound the way they do." "Maybe not," I replied gently. "But intentions matter less than actions sometimes." After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I thought about the phrase Rachel always come through. It sounded complimentary on the surface. Reliable. Dependable. Generous. But underneath, it revealed something deeper. Rachel no longer saw my support as a choice. She saw it as a certainty. A guarantee. A resource. The following afternoon, I attended my meeting with Daniel. We reviewed documents for nearly 2 hours. At one point, he set down his pen and looked directly at me. "Margaret, I need to ask you something." "All right. If you remove the financial support, what do you think will happen?" I considered the question carefully. Months earlier, the answer would have frightened me. Now it felt different. "I think I will finally learn the truth." Daniel nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Some truths arrive dramatically. Others arrive quietly after years of being ignored. As I drove home beneath gray autumn skies, I realized I was no longer afraid of the answer. Whatever happened next would not create the truth. It would simply reveal what had been there all along. The next step was surprisingly simple. I decided to stop guessing and start observing. For years, Rachel had assumed my support would always be available. Now I wanted to see what happened when certainty disappeared. A few days after meeting with Daniel, I called Rachel and told her I wanted to discuss finances. She sounded concerned immediately. Not worried about me, worried about the subject itself. We agreed to meet for lunch at a small cafe downtown. It was a place we had visited many times over the years. When I arrived, Rachel was already there scrolling through her phone. She smiled when she saw me, but there was tension behind it. After ordering sandwiches and iced tea, I got straight to the point. "I have been reviewing my retirement plans," I said calmly. Rachel nodded. "That sounds responsible. Part of that review includes reducing expenses and becoming more cautious with investments." Her expression changed almost instantly. The smile remained, but her eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" I stirred my tea slowly. "Nothing dramatic. I simply think it is time to be more careful with money." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "You are healthy. You own your home. You have always been financially secure." I noticed she never asked what I wanted. She only focused on what she expected. "Things change," I replied. "People should prepare for that." For the rest of lunch, she seemed distracted. The conversation never fully recovered. When we parted ways, she hugged me quickly and promised to call soon. She did not call soon. In fact, nearly a week passed before I heard from her again. That alone told me more than any argument could have. During that week, I stayed busy. I attended my book club meeting. I spent an afternoon helping at the local food pantry. I even took a day trip to a nearby Lake Harold, and I used to visit every autumn. The more distance I created from the constant requests and expectations, the clearer everything became. Then one evening Emily called. Her voice sounded uneasy. "Grandma, are you okay?" "I am doing very well, sweetheart." She hesitated. "Mom seems stressed." I sat quietly and waited. "She keeps talking about money and timelines and investors." Emily sighed. "I think she expected something to happen already." I looked out the window toward the backyard where golden leaves covered the grass. Sometimes expectations are not the same thing as reality. Emily was silent for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with me. "I think people forget where blessings come from when they receive them for too long." After we ended the call, I thought about those words. People forget where blessings come from. Perhaps that was exactly what had happened. Over time, gratitude had faded and entitlement had taken its place. The following morning, Daniel called with another update. Most of the paperwork was ready. We could proceed whenever I felt comfortable. For the first time since my birthday, I felt completely calm. Not angry. Not hurt. Calm. Because the test was already producing results. I had not refused anything. I had not canceled anything. I had merely introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty was revealing more truth than certainty ever had. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. It was short, direct, businesslike. "Have you made any decisions about the investment?" I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone down without answering. Then I walked outside and continued trimming roses in the garden. The flowers needed attention. My peace needed protection. And for the first time in many years, I knew exactly which one mattered more. 3 days later, I met Daniel one final time before making my decision official. The morning was cold and clear. Sunlight reflected off office windows downtown as I parked across from his building. I carried no folder this time. Everything had already been reviewed. Every account. Every trust. Every document connected to years of support. Daniel greeted me with the same calm professionalism he always had. We sat across from each other in the conference room, and he carefully walked me through the final revisions. Educational funds would remain protected. Charitable contributions would increase. Certain distributions would be redirected. Other arrangements would simply end. Nothing vindictive. Nothing impulsive. Just thoughtful decisions based on current realities. When he finished, he slid the documents toward me. I read every page slowly. Then I signed. The act itself took less than 2 minutes. Years of assumptions ended with the movement of a pen. As I handed the papers back, I expected to feel sadness. Instead, I felt relief. Not because I was taking something away from anyone, because I was finally taking responsibility for my own future. After leaving Daniel's office, I stopped at a small bakery and bought myself a cinnamon roll and a cup of coffee. It seemed like an ordinary thing to do, but I could not remember the last time I had celebrated a decision that benefited only me. Most of my life had been spent taking care of other people. Harold, Rachel, family, friends. There was satisfaction in that. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that my own well-being mattered too. Later that afternoon, Rachel called again. Her voice sounded more urgent than usual. "Mom, have you thought about the investment?" I sat in my sunroom watching birds gather near the feeder outside. "Yes," I replied. Silence followed. "And?" she asked. "I have decided not to participate." The silence became much longer this time. "What do you mean?" "I mean I will not be investing." Rachel let out a short breath. "You cannot be serious." The words caught my attention immediately. Not disappointment. Not curiosity. Not respect. Certainty that my answer could not possibly be final. "I am serious." Her tone sharpened. "But we have already started planning." I looked out at the garden. A squirrel darted across the fence line carrying an acorn. Life continued peacefully outside my window. "Planning is not the same as having funding," I said quietly. Rachel sounded frustrated now. "Mom, this affects everything." There it was again. Everything. As though my resources existed primarily to support her plans. We ended the call a few minutes later without reaching any understanding. Afterward, I placed my phone face down on the table and continued reading my book. An hour later, another call arrived. This time from Jason. Then a text message. Then another. I did not respond immediately. 4 years, every request had received instant attention. For the first time, I allowed myself the luxury of time. That evening, Emily called. Unlike the others, she did not ask about money. She asked how I was feeling. We spoke for nearly half an hour. Before hanging up, she said something simple. "Grandma, I hope you are making choices that make you happy." I smiled. I think I finally am. After the call ended, I sat quietly in Harold's old chair and looked around the room we had shared for decades. The photographs on the shelves had not changed. The furniture had not changed. The house had not changed. But I had. For the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to expectations. I was acting according to my own judgment. And deep down, I suspected the real test had only just begun. The following week brought exactly what I had expected. Not reflection. Not understanding. Pressure. The phone calls became more frequent. The messages became more direct. Rachel was no longer pretending the conversation was about opportunity. Now it was about urgency. According to her, investors were waiting. Timelines were shrinking. Decisions needed to be made immediately. Every problem seemed to require access to money that no longer belonged to her plans. What surprised me was not her reaction. What surprised me was how predictable it had become. One evening, Rachel invited me to dinner again. This time the invitation felt less like a family gathering and more like a meeting. I accepted. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different from previous visits. Jason greeted me politely, but his smile seemed strained. Rachel was unusually attentive. She offered me my favorite tea. She asked about my garden. She even complimented my new sweater. Years ago, I would have been touched by the effort. Now I recognized it for what it was. A strategy. During dinner, the conversation remained pleasant. Emily talked about a scholarship opportunity she was pursuing. I listened proudly as she described her goals. Unlike many people her age, she spoke about earning opportunities rather than expecting them. As the meal continued, I noticed Rachel growing impatient. Eventually she set down her fork. "Mom, we really need to revisit the investment discussion." There it was, right on schedule. I folded my napkin carefully and looked at her. "I thought we already discussed it." "You said no." Her voice remained calm but barely. "I am asking you to reconsider." Jason immediately joined the conversation. He explained projections, growth potential, future returns. The presentation sounded polished, almost rehearsed. I listened respectfully. When they finished, I took a sip of water. My answer has not changed. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence we had shared before. Rachel stared at me. For a moment I thought she might actually ask why. Instead she said something else. "I just do not understand why you are doing this." The question lingered between us. Not because it was difficult to answer, because the answer was so simple. "I am making decisions that I believe are responsible." Rachel shook her head. "This affects our future." I looked directly at her. "Then perhaps your future should not depend on my checkbook." Jason immediately looked away. Emily lowered her eyes toward her plate. Rachel's face tightened. The conversation ended soon afterward. No one raised their voice. No one argued. Yet the drive home felt strangely peaceful. For years, I had feared disappointing Rachel. Now I realized something important. Disappointment was not the same thing as harm. People survive disappointment every day. The next morning, I received a call from Daniel. Everything had been finalized. Every revision, every adjustment, every legal protection. There was nothing left to reconsider. After hanging up, I walked outside and sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee. The air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter. Across the yard, sunlight touched the last remaining roses. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely free from uncertainty. The decisions were made. The documents were complete. The future no longer depended on assumptions. As I sat there quietly, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Rachel. This one was different. Short. Frustrated. Almost angry. I read it once, then placed the phone face down beside me. Beyond the garden fence, a flock of birds lifted into the morning sky. Watching them disappear into the distance, I realized that some people only appreciate support after it is no longer guaranteed. And very soon, Rachel was about to learn exactly how much she had taken for granted. 2 weeks before Christmas, I invited Rachel, Jason, and Emily to my house for dinner. The invitation surprised them. For months, our conversations had been tense and carefully controlled. Rachel accepted immediately. I suspect she believed the evening would finally bring good news. Perhaps she thought I had reconsidered. Perhaps she thought persistence had worked. Either way, she arrived with confidence. I spent the afternoon preparing the meal myself. The dining room looked exactly as it had for decades. The same oak table. The same silver candle holders Harold and I had received as a wedding gift. The same family photographs displayed along the sideboard. Looking around the room, I realized how much of my life had been spent creating a place where people felt welcome. As evening settled outside, the family gathered around the table. Dinner was pleasant enough. Rachel talked about future plans. Jason discussed potential business opportunities. More than once, I heard them speak as though success was simply waiting around the corner. Emily remained quiet, occasionally meeting my eyes across the table. After dessert, I stood and carried a small folder from my study into the dining room. The conversation stopped immediately. Rachel looked at the folder and then at me. I could almost see hope returning to her face. I sat down and folded my hands. "There is something I want to share with all of you." The room became silent. Over the past several months, I have spent a great deal of time reviewing my finances, my future, and the responsibilities I carry. Rachel nodded quickly. Jason leaned forward in his chair. "I have finalized several decisions." I opened the folder calmly. The investment proposal will not be funded. The additional financial support that has been requested will not be provided. My estate documents and trust arrangements have been updated. Future resources will be distributed according to plans that reflect my values and priorities. The silence that followed felt different from every other silence we had experienced. This one carried understanding. Rachel stared at me. "You already made the changes?" she asked quietly. Yes. Her face lost color. Without discussing it with us? I looked at her carefully. The decisions concerned my future, Rachel. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Rachel looked down at the table before speaking again. I cannot believe you would do this. I thought about that statement for a moment. Then I smiled gently. I think what you mean is that you cannot believe I would finally make a decision for myself. No one responded. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly past the dining room windows. The house remained warm and peaceful. After a long silence, Emily spoke. Grandma has every right to decide what happens with her own money. Rachel looked at her daughter in surprise. Emily met her gaze without hesitation. It was the first time I had ever seen her do that. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I stood and began collecting dessert plates. The conversation was over. The decision had already been made. Later, after everyone left, I stood alone by the front window watching their car disappear down the street. The house was quiet once again. But unlike the silence after my birthday dinner, this silence felt different. It felt honest. For the first time in years, there were no assumptions left. No hidden expectations. No confusion about where anyone stood. I thought about everything that had happened since that evening at the restaurant. The phone calls. The pressure. The disappointment. The revelations. In the end, the greatest gift was not financial security. It was clarity. Because money never changed my family. It simply revealed who they had been all along. And the moment I stopped funding other people's expectations was the moment I finally started investing in my own peace.